Well, hey there. Thanks so much for tuning in this morning. I am Susan Smith. You are in my studio, Stitched by Susan, and this is a brand new episode of Live and Unscripted. So, welcome. Live and Unscripted usually means, as per its title, we're streaming live. We have not scripted this in advance, and you're going to get to see me working through a quilting project in real time and sipping coffee while I work. So generally these episodes mean that I do a project from loading through quilting all the way to completion. Today we're going to be working from almost the beginning, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But I hope that this is really helpful to quilters who feel a little bit paralyzed when they get a quilt loaded at their machine and there's decisions that they have to make regarding it, or there's challenges involved in the quilt, what to do with those things. So I try to offer on these episodes a variety of different challenges, I guess you would say, whether it's the seaming on the backing, or whether it's bias edges or slippery fabrics or wavy borders, all those different things. So today's particular focus is going to be on basically the type of fabric and the challenges that that's creating in the quilt. So the quilt I'm working on today, both top and bottom of it, is this, it's kind of a new style of fabric that we're just seeing in the last couple years in quilting shops. It's not exactly flannel. It feels a little more like suede, but it has similar properties to flannel in that it's quite flexible and stretchy, and it frays like crazy. So these are some of the challenges that we get to work with today. So before we dive into that, a couple of introductory things. I'm quilting on my long arm Lucy, who happens to be out of camera because I've already got the quilt loaded. And again, I'll come back to that in a second, why I did that today. But Lucy, my long arm, is a Gamel Elevate, but I will be quilting entirely freehand today. There's no digital or pantograph involved in this particular design. And if you enjoy these episodes, I welcome you to like and subscribe, and also to share them. So I believe you can, even in the lower right-hand corner right now, share if you have friends that you think are interested, or later on share the link to the show to someone that you think might be helped by these episodes that I do. So I'd appreciate that. Yeah, say hello for wherever you're chiming in from, and I'll get in a couple more sips of coffee while we greet each other before we get started quilting. Wow, my husband's loading, because apparently it's taken time to get the comments loaded up. I will say a quick couple of thank yous. One is to my husband, Dave, who's always behind the scenes in these productions. So there you get to see the back of his head and kind of the setup. Lucy is kind of hemmed about by cameras and wires and cables and all that sort of stuff. So he makes all the magic happen. And also another great big thank you to our friend Dan Unger, who provides the beautiful guitar music that you hear throughout these episodes. So thanks to both those guys, the big D's. Okay, and we're having a monitor problem this morning, which basically means, Dave, I am completely unable to read the comments. So you guys, we're going to have to make a change on the fly and live. Sorry. Our one monitor, the color is gibbled and it's going out to you good, but what I'm seeing is funky, so I actually can't read the comments. So Dave's going to try and fix that while we work, but I'm just going to go ahead and proceed, and I'll just say hello and welcome to everybody, wherever you're watching from. I'm so glad you joined me. So one more sip, and we'll get talking about the quilt. Oh, one more thing I did want to say before I go too much further. These live and unscripted have been on Mondays, and most recently the first and third Monday of each month, and we're actually changing that up. So if you got my newsletter, you'll already know this, and I'll mention it in a couple of future newsletters. So if you need a reminder, go to my website and sign up for that newsletter. But basically our family schedule is just shifting a bit, so we are going to move this to Friday. So same time, 9 a.m. Pacific, and still the first and third Friday of each month. So that will be happening right after this episode. So next one will be October 15, which is a Friday, and we'll proceed from there. Yeah, I think that's about it for today. So what I did today is I began by already loading the quilt, just in the interest of saving time, because I knew this was going to be a bit longer project today than sometimes if I talked through the whole loading process too. So I thought instead I'll just focus on the fabric that we're working with today and talk a little more about that. There's lots of episodes that you can go back to where I go through the loading process in much more detail. where you can see that and how I use the red snapper system and things like that. So I will be showing you how I baste and how I square up this quilt as I go. So that will still be really helpful for you. So I've got my backing loaded on, I've got my Hobbs 80/20 batting laid on, and my quilt top. And my quilt top is floating. So you're seeing my hands make this motion here. It's just going over the front edge of my machine and it's puddling on the floor right in front of me. So is my batting. That's called a floating top. It's my preference for this type of freehand quilting because it's not super fussy and I just baste the sides as I'm advancing the quilt. And the rest of the quilt that's undone so far can just lay on the floor until I get to it. It does mean that I have to pay attention to keeping this edge straight. And you'll see that as I work. I often refer to, eyeballing that my seam allowances are falling straight and things like that. And I'll use my trusty magnets as well to keep this front edge squared up. So for today's purposes, I've got all those pieces loaded and I'm fixing to baste down my quilt top. So for this first base, I'm going to go up the left side, across the top, and down the right side. And I've already started pinning because I've got a lot of excess fabric. I wonder if we could change camera angles already, Dave, so that they could see that. Can we see this side? Okay. While he does that, I'll keep on pinning so as not to lose time, and we'll change camera angles and I'll show you what we're working with today. This fabric, as far as I know, if it's got a name like flannel or minky, I don't know what the name is, but it is, this side is what you're seeing, yes. It is, I believe, still 100% cotton. Quilting shops are selling it, and it has this suede-y kind of finish to it, but it is super stretchy. And on this particular quilt, that problem is exacerbated by the fact that all the squares are set on point, and so the entire perimeter of the quilt is a bias edge. So the maker has been kind enough to do what I call a victory lap. So she's done a basting stitch to keep it from fraying and to keep it from stretching any worse, but the truth of it is there's already a serious lot of stretch in the edge of this quilt. So I've got to figure out a way to hem that in. So the first thing that I did before I loaded was I took a couple of measurements of the width of the quilt in a couple different places so that I could kind of try and determine what the fixed width should be. And I am going to use my trusty tape measure throughout this quilt to keep that width consistent. Okay, so I've concluded that it's 60.5 inches. So I will be adjusting my quilt. Like, it literally is all crazy stretchy because there's so much bias. And so I'm just going to adjust that and manipulate it to keep my quilt at the 60.5 that I've determined is the right size. That means on my outer edge, I've got a ton of excess that I've got to pull in. So I'm using my pins every at least 2 inches. In this corner over here where it's the worst for rippling, I'll probably even use more. So I'm trying to distribute that fullness evenly so that I don't run it all into one place and get a pleat as I'm basting. So that's the value of pins when you've got a lot of this to work with. It just distributes it and keeps it from moving. And another thing that I'm going to end up doing, I don't know that it shows on the camera because it's not square on, but this corner, there really is so much stretch that I'm going to let a little bit of this corner actually hang off past my basting and it's going to get trimmed. So it's not going to be visible. The quilt is going to look square. I feel like that's a better solution than running my basting on the actual edge and then the corners of my quilt would look pulled out and pointy. So these are some of the decisions that I make as I go, depending on what the quilt is looking like. So again, that's part of the appeal, I hope, of these live and unscripted episodes, is that I talk you through what I'm looking at and why I make the decisions I do, so that when you're faced with whatever the difficulty may be, you can kind of use the same process. Evaluate the factors. Sometimes you have to choose the lesser of two evils. And in this case, it's having a wonky shaped corner or trimming off a little bit of quilt. So I choose trimming off a little bit of quilt. All right, now we've got a monitor that's working better. If Dave gets me in camera, I will try and read the monitor and say hello to everybody. Okay, let's see. Who is chiming in this morning and from where? And let me get another sip of coffee while we talk. Sue Rickman, good grief. That would be good. Okay, Dave was telling me about your comments, your little typos going on, but I know what you mean. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depends on where you're tuning in from, but welcome in any event. Jeannie, gorgeous fall day here in New Brunswick. Hope you're getting together with grandkids this Thanksgiving. And at some point this fall I am, that's for sure. Joey, good morning, Susan and Dave. This looks like it's going to be a very interesting morning. You bet it is. It's going to be a gorgeous quilt too. Gosh, the name. Anyway, you're from Alaska. Hey, cutie, hoping you have a blessed day. Chuck and Levon, Alaska. Well, I like your black bear picture, and I hope you have a great day too. Oh, okay, so Jeannie was talking to Sue. So here's the problem, you guys. There seem to be so many quilter Sues and Susans. We're getting confused over who's talking to whom. But anyway, gorgeous and bankrupt with the leaves. Nice. Sherry, bad news, my back went out. Ooh, good news. I'm off work and get to watch you live. Yay! You know, that's the silver lining right there. Good for you. Christy, hi from Maryland. Sue Swanstrom, another Sue. Good morning from Montana. Welcome. Donna, good morning from Woburn, Massachusetts. Mickey, good morning, a little late. Hey, better late than never. That's what my mother used to say. Sharon from Bel Air, Kansas. And that's all that's chiming in. Well, I'm so glad you all are here. Let's get started quilting. So I'm going to start basting. I've loaded the machine with a dark charcoal really, thread. Dave's telling me something about my cord. There we go. Ha! Turn the light off, he's telling me. Okay, so I'm just carefully moving Lucy, making sure I don't catch any wires today. Once we've made one good pass, we know everything is in place. I did forget to thread the needle, so forgive me while I do that. All right, so this will be kind of the typical baste, which is I start on the left, try to stitch within the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and go all the way up the right. Something's funky with my bobbin thread. 1 second while I reload that. And I use the same thread top and bottom. That's my preference always. And the backing of this quilt, which you can see a little bit, is a plaid, the same as one of the fabrics that's on the top. So that charcoal thread will go very well on both, and it is 100% poly thread. The brand that I like is Isacord. So that's what I'm using today. Now I am going to turn my channel lock on because I'm lucky enough to have that feature. That locks my machine so that it can't move from left to right, and all I have to concentrate on then is getting those ripples in place, distributed throughout my stitching. And as you can see, my seam allowance is getting a little wider. This is where I talked about we're going to lose a little bit of quilt on that corner. And in case you're wondering, yes, I'm a bad girl and I stitch over my pins. I do it slowly and carefully. And I'm using all the tricks we've talked about in the past. I'm putting tension on the area of my quilt that is already stitched. I'm doing things while I talk. I'm also sometimes when I need more excess pulled in, I'm actually grasping the fabric and pulling it under the needle. And I'm just going to shift my channel lock a wee bit, about 1/8 of an inch. So I'm just going to slowly work my way across the top. And while I do that, a couple of episodes ago, I'll mention something else that's helpful in this quilt. I did a small episode on blocking a quilt. This is a kind of quilt where that would be really beneficial. So even after all my efforts to square it up, distribute all the fullness, etc., and make square corners, chances are when this comes off the long arm, because of the bias, you will still be able to manhandle it in any direction. So I strongly suggest for the maker, whenever she washes this quilt, You could partially dry it in the dryer, but while it is at least still damp, to spread it on top of a bed or on the floor and square it up. And it doesn't have to be a precise science, just visually square it up to let it dry. And that will really help it hold its shape too. It's apt to always be kind of wanting to go wonky on you. But I tell you what, this fabric feels so good. I think it's worth it. Don't let it discourage you from using this type of fabric necessarily. It's got this lovely suede-y, silky touch. I quite like it, but I suspect it's not very easy to sew with either for piecing. But it is going to make a very cozy and warm quilt. It's a little bit heavy like flannel too, so it will certainly be cozy. Just pulling that last little bit of excess under the needle. Okay, we've got it basted. While I take all the pins out, here's another consideration that I put into this quilt. Because I'm going to be needing to manipulate the fabric the whole time that I'm quilting it, because there's so much bias in it, it's going to want to be moving, shifting, and it's always going to be an issue to control the movement of the fabric. And so I wanted to choose a quilting design that would help with that and not fight against me. I've talked about this before. When you've got a quilt that you've got to be taking up excess or manipulating the fabric a little bit, you do not want to be trying to quilt straight lines. It will make you pull your hair out and say bad things. So I have chosen something that is all curves for this quilt, and I call it a topographic meander, which is a big old long phrase for a meander that looks kind of like the topographical lines you see on a map. So it will provide really great texture, I think, because there's pretty even spacing. It's masculine, which this quilt is, and it's got a lot of curves, which take up some of that excess fabric that I've got to manipulate. So, win-win in my opinion. Just trying to get my little snaps on the outer edges of the quilt. Are there more folks chiming in that we want to say hello to? While Dave shifts cameras, you can see that I'm kind of smoothing down this front edge, making sure that there's no ripples going on in here. There's no excess fabric pushing up against my basting. So now that that's all smooth, I'm going to put my magnetic bars on the front to hold this in place. And then I've got a working space that can't shift. So I'll do that while he pulls up a couple more folks saying good morning. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, who's chiming in? Oh, Sue. A lot of Susans, but we all answer to every comment question. Isn't that the truth? So true. Here's another Sue from Illinois. How fun. And Diana chiming in from Texas. Good. Darlene, waiting for Arlene to arrive. So you guys are great filler for me. Glad to oblige. And Sylvia, good evening from Germany. Susan, I like this video a lot. Thanks for your work. Also to Dave. You're welcome. This is really fun for us too, honestly. Dawn, hi Susan, happy Monday. Same to you. And Marie from Georgia. Well, welcome. So for those of you who have just tuned in, we're working on a freehand edge-to-edge quilting project. My live and unscripted episodes typically are, well, just that. They're live streaming, so it's real time. And it's me working on a quilting project, kind of talking my way through it, through the decisions I'm making, through the particular focuses for that quilt. So for today's purposes, this quilt is a kind of cross between flannel and suede. It's 100% cotton fabric, but it has a lot of properties of flannel. It's super flexible and slippery a little bit, and it frays really badly around all the edges. So today's focus is to square it up. There are also a lot of bias edges because it's all set on point. And so the perimeter of the quilt is bias, and of course the straight line here is all bias fabric. So working on squaring that up. So one other thing I wanted to mention, these episodes are always free, but if you're interested in supporting them, you know that I love my coffee. I'm going to have to get a sip before I start quilting. And if you want to support this show and future episodes, you can just go to buymeacoffee.com/stitched by Susan. And there you're able to make a one-time contribution. And I sure appreciate those of you who have done it. Some of you have been really generous, and we've been able, excuse me, to purchase a new camera. So the camera that does the close-up work on the quilt that you see today is one that we've purchased with our coffee fund. And you'll see it's really nice and clear and super beautiful. So thank you for that. All right, we're ready to get quilting. This is a design that I actually recently devised, worked out on a quilt. I don't think that it's brand spanking new. I think that other people have done it, but it's always been a pantograph or a digital design. I'm not aware of anyone else who has been doing it freehand. So as you'll see, it's going to look much like a topographic map. And I do not know on such a dark quilt how much of the actual quilting you're going to be able to appreciate. So I will focus my talking more on, dealing with fabric movement and stabilizing and how I move around the quilt top and that sort of thing. I will say this about this design in case you want to go home and try it. It is a glorified swirl. So I'm quilting my way into the swirl and then quilting between the lines back out of the swirl. You can see that I'm using my left hand as a counterweight. I'm fairly comfortable quilting with one hand. If you're not, I've shown you in other episodes my vegetable can trick, which is basically to put a can of something, veggies, beans, whatever you like, on either side of the quilting arm, and that acts as a bit of a counterweight, and it's just enough to stretch the fabric just a little and take up the excess in your quilting. So either way you do it will work fine. Cans you will obviously have to keep shifting. If you have never quilted with just one hand, this is not a bad design to practice on because it's pretty darn forgiving. So maybe Dave will turn some pretty music on for us, and I'm just going to quilt like crazy till I get through one pass. And then we'll talk some more about the basting process as I advance to the next pass across the quilt. You're probably seeing my tape measure in the camera shot too. I will also talk more about that as we work our way into the next pass. And I'll show you how I use that to keep the quilt top nice and square. I'm just always watchful as I'm quilting for any fabric that may be pushing in front of my hopper foot. And that's what my left hand does. And you probably can't see on camera, but its balance is always shifting here and there, pushing a little right, pushing a little left. Wherever I see that some excess is pulling up, I just manipulate the fabric just a hair. And if I do that all the way through the process, I never end up with a huge ripple that I don't know what to do with. One other way that you could deal with it if you're not comfortable one-handed quilting or with the veggie cans is to put pins here and there that basically cause the fabric to be evenly distributed, and you know, as you're nearing a pin, you can be gauging. Am I pushing too much of it to the right? Is too much of it going to the left? And so you can use that as a kind of check and balance to make sure you're getting all the fabric put where it needs to be. Feel free to type in any questions that are arising as I'm quilting. I'm nearly to the end of this pass, but I will talk about advancing and basting and squaring up as I move on to the next pass. But if you have other questions, now's the time. On this one tweedy fabric, it is almost impossible, even for me, 12 inches away, to see my quilting. But it's going to be beautiful texture. Okay, and we'll just park Lucy needle down in that basting edge, and she will just roll up as we advance. So I will take away all my anchoring bits, my magnets on the front, my clips on the side. And with the needle down, I will just go ahead and roll the machine up. Okay, let's have a few comments and or questions, and I'm going to grab my cup of coffee while you guys are commenting. And by the way, I'm carefully standing away from the quilt, so you don't worry that I'm going to spill my coffee on it. Beverly, good morning. Beverly, can I let the cat out of the bag? This is Bev's quilt that I'm working on, so I'm glad she's tuning in and watching. Lynn, hello from Northern Michigan. Nice to see you. And
earlier, and this is a question
I'm just listening to Dave here for a second. Okay. Joey, is there something that could have been done when piecing with this fabric? No, I honestly don't think so, Joey. It just is the quality of the fabric, like flannel. It just shifts all the time, and of course the fraying too. So like possibly that victory lap that I talked about on the outside edge, you know, maybe if Bev had had a walking foot, she could have pulled in more of that excess with the basting line, perhaps. But it just is one of the perils of this fabric. But like I said, if you want to give it a try, don't let that stop you. You just have to be aware when you're working on it and find ways of coping with it. But it's going to make a stunning quilt. So I think it's worth it. Any more comments? Oh yeah, lots more. Topographic meander. That just sounds so complex. So if you can think of a simpler name like squiggles, you know, we could always call it something different. But to me, this is what it looks like as a topographic map. There we go. Hi, Dawn. Susan, what color of thread are you using to quilt? I've got a charcoal gray. If by chance you use Isacord, it's number 0112. It's just a dark charcoal gray. And I have it top and bottom, same thread. Sherry, what are the side clamps that you're using? I bought some that have the dowel, similar to red snappers, but they're difficult to get the fabric evenly distributed when putting them on. I'll show you mine. These are put out by Red Snapper as well. Woo, there we go. The fabric slides into a very thin little channel in there, and then this snaps shut. And there's kind of rubber grippers. So I do like them. When I first got them, they were very stiff. I couldn't close them with one hand. They've improved with age, much like the rest of us. And they work pretty well. You have to have a fairly straight and fairly smooth edge to slide it into this channel. It is less than 1/8 of an inch thick. So that can be the tricky bit. One of the tips they gave me when I purchased them was to actually use one of my quilting pins when necessary to just run along that channel and encourage the fabric to go in. But anyway, these are by Red Snapper. I think this is the longest width they offer, and they're, I believe, 18 inches. I have a 26-inch throat, so I like the biggest one I can that holds the most possible fabric, nice and snug. I'm not necessarily a proponent of this brand. I just know that I like a slim profile, and I like them to be nice and long to pull all the fabric evenly. Jeannie, think this is the perfect pattern for this quilt. I'm glad you agree. I thought so too. I know it's for Bev's husband, so it's for a guy. So I wanted something, you know, nice and masculine to suit the quilt. Lynn, so your pattern is of varied sizes, just random? You betcha. And whenever I've got an awkward corner to fill, I just continue on echoing around, and it just all fits in, just like an actual topographical map. Those lines just go every which way. Okay, that's it for questions. All right. So let's work on basting, and let's talk about the trusty pink tape measure. So I do have a resources page on my website with, I believe, a link to this tape measure. It's just Amazon, but if you purchase it from my website, I do get a tiny little kickback on that. But anyway, the important thing about it is it's got inch markings on it, and it's long. So I've just got it anchored on the rails on either end of my machine, just with a little office clip that's holding a little loop around the rail. And therefore I can shift it a little bit, because I know I want my quilt to be 60.5 inches. I determined that before I loaded it. I'm looking for the 26-inch mark on this side, and I'm looking for 32.5 on the right. So I've got those numbers in my head, and my tape measure's not moving. So every time I advance the quilt, I'm going to shift this top until it fits within my 26 and my 32.5. Therefore, I know my quilt will be 60.5 inches all the way down. Make sense? My batting and my top are floating, so you're seeing me kind of grasp a little pleat of the fabric, and I'm kind of grabbing my batting from underneath too and giving it a bit of a tug. If you just roll the batting and don't adjust it at all, I find that it tends to pull up faster in the middle, and you end up with your batting curving and wanting to give you pleats. If that sounds too crazy to you, just flip the whole top back so you can see the batting, and make sure that there's no rumples, like not even creases, but just no fullness getting pulled up under there. Having done that, I'll pull my quilt top back over it. And all this excess batting and quilt top are just floating, hanging down the front in front of me. So we're going to baste the left side and baste the right side to fix them in place, and then we'll put our magnetic bars on. And then once again, we have a surface that is at that point fixed and can't shift from side to side. Okay, got our 32.5, and I'm taking advantage of pins today. This quilt is so shifty that you use the tools that work for the occasion, right? I don't always have to use pins. Sometimes just the fabric, you know, sticking to the batting will be enough to kind of hold it in place. But today, I need that extra little guardrail of having pins in there. So just every 2 or 3 inches along the edge. And I do not put my side clamps on until I've got this basting done. If I put the side clamps on first, because they're just on the backing, they would pull it a little bit askew. They'd pull the backing harder, if you know what I mean, and it would be too snug. So this way, my quilt top and my backing are both sort of relaxed with no tension on them. And so once I've basted them, then I can put tension on the backing and the whole thing will pull snug. Let me know if I'm not making sense. Sometimes I wonder if I'm using the right adjectives, and also if I am being successful doing and talking at the same time, or if one of them's coming out a little garbled. So I'm having to manipulate my quilt a little bit to get it to come over to my 26-inch marking. I'm going ahead and doing that because all of these seams are bias. That's not the right word. The seams this way are straight, but the give on the fabric this way is bias. So I'm literally manipulating my quilt until it fits within the measurements that I've determined it should be. And if you missed that part earlier, I had the quilt smoothed out on a bed top before I loaded it on the quilting machine, and I measured it a couple times this way and a couple times this way to try and conclude what the finished size should be. So that's where I got my 60.5 inches. That was not just a random number that I picked. That's the size I thought was kind of an average, and I could fit the quilt into it. Lots of pins on this side because there's a fair bit of excess here. I'm pinning every inch in places to try and keep that nice and even. Okay, so my needle's down on the far right-hand side. I know Dave will change the camera so you can see me any minute. So I'm just going to continue basting down that side because that's where I'm at. Sewing slowly and carefully over my pins, using my fingertips to push any excess fabric that I might have under the needle as fast as I need it to go to be stitched up before I get to the next pin. Did that make sense? I don't know, but you guys get to see it, and hopefully the combination of my somewhat faltering words and the visual get the point across. So I'm pulling the pins out, and while I'm here, I'm going to quickly snap on my stretcher, clip, brace, whatever you want to call it, on the right-hand side. And now I'm moving over to the left. We might want a close-up view on this one, Dave, because I really am dealing with a lot of excess fabric here. There you go. I don't know if you guys can see it because, of course, the fabric excess is in front of the hopper foot. But I'm literally grabbing what is already stitched and giving a little tug to it to pull it under the needle more quickly. And the more that I've got to pull under there, the harder I pull on that, basically. Now I'm dealing with a really thick seam, so I'm just going to pause for a minute, get my trusty seam ripper, and literally cause that to go under the hopper foot. These are just things I've kind of learned with experience, and I find if I just go a little bit slowly, I can usually head off some of these possible disasters at the pass. You know, if I had just pushed over that seam, it would have pushed my fabric really askew. So I just stopped, fed it under. Here I'm going to stop because I see another one coming, and I'm just going to get another pin in there. Another checkpoint, if you will. all that excess has been taken up. Perfect. So I'm going to break my thread here because I'm going to start stitching at the other end. When I'm doing freehand edge-to-edge designs, I always alternate the direction of my passes. This design is not very directional, but sometimes if you're doing leaves or feathers or something like that, if you always go left to right, advance your quilt left to right, you'll start to see, you know, it looks like a stiff breeze has caught your quilting and it's all leaning toward one direction. So my rule of thumb is I just make it a habit to do one pass from left to right and the next one from right to left and keep alternating like that. So if you're just chiming in, I call these episodes live and unscripted because it is live streaming of a freehand quilting project. It is in real time. There are often oopses, but this is what work looks like in my studio. And I'm just kind of inviting you in to look over my shoulder and talking through my processes. So, got my quilt top all loaded, all in place on my advance. Gonna pop my magnets back on the front. If you're enjoying this, once again, I ask that you like and subscribe to the channel. You'll be notified then when new episodes are available. And also, if you sign up for my newsletter, you will get advance notice of when the episodes are coming. And they are changing from my typical, which has been Monday morning, to being Friday, first and third Friday of each month. So after this episode, they'll be Fridays. Okay, so we're back on the right-hand side. So I'm just pulling up my bobbin thread, doing a few lock stitches just within that little basting allowance. And we're off and stitching again. Mr. Producer's telling me something. Ah, okay. Hang on a second. I'm going to just back up my quilt a little bit because I see that the camera's a bit too close to the back roll. Look at that. We aim to please. All right, now you'll be able to see everything. Here we go. So we're just going to continue on with more of the same. So I chose this particular design for a couple of reasons. One is it's quite masculine, this topographical map look. Two is it's got a lot of curves, which is really useful for if I need to manipulate fabric, which is what's happening in this quilt. I'm having to really pay attention to keep everything smooth and flat. And so doing a curvy design like this is really helpful. Trying to quilt straight lines on this would cause a lot of hair pulling to be going on. I kind of can't emphasize that enough. As a freehand quilter, that is just top of my list of design choices. Is it suitable for any of the challenges in my quilt? Because that will make the difference between having an enjoyable, fun time quilting and, you know, doing a pattern that looks easy, quote unquote, to doing something that you're fighting against it the whole time and it can be really, really miserable. So, in the case of this quilt, the curves are a great feature. And this particular meander is just basically a glorified swirl. I'm swirling in, I'm swirling back out. And all I've done is play with the shape of my swirl to create this little topographic type design. Something that you probably can't see because the quilting does not show up a bunch is I'm trying to prevent my swirls also from looking too much like they're in rows. So I'm purposely making them irregular in shape and making some larger and some smaller. Again, so that when it is viewed afterwards, people can't tell easily what my quilting path was or where my rows were or where my passes were. It all looks seamless. So if Mr. Producer wants to turn some pretty music on for you again, I'll just quilt all the way to the other side. Type in your questions as they arise, and when I go to do the next advance, I will pop back and answer some questions. And that little pause is me just looking ahead, saying, where do I need to be going? Which direction do I want to head? This design is super easy to maneuver across the quilt because, of course, you can just add a line of echoing to get where you want to go. But sometimes I do have to pause and just take stock. One of the things I love about freehand quilting too is you have absolute control over where the stitching ends or lands. And so in this quilt I'm seeing a number of quite bulky seam allowances, not because there's so many layers, but because the fabric is so thick. So even, you know, where there's an intersection of 4 fabrics, it can be quite thick. So I purposely try to make my stitching cross over those areas that are thick. That will create a much more flat looking result in the end. If you quilt around those seams, it serves the opposite purpose. It makes them pop up and be really visible and catch the eye. So I like to quilt over them or as close to them as I can, within 1/8 of an inch or so, and that really helps them to lay down. I have a real funny shaped one here, and you know what? That's totally fine. That's the way topographic maps work. There's a bit of a hillock there. I'm going a little slower here because this is where I'm dealing with quite a bit of that excess, that stretch, if you will, that we had on the outside edge. So I'm really trying to manage the stretched parts and pull them back into place and stitch them down securely. And the critical thing, of course, is to get the fabric evenly distributed. That's what will make it look smooth and flat in the end. I'm just taking a little more time using my left hand to maneuver that. I'm just feeling the edge of my side clamp. I'm bumping into it, so I'm going to use my trusty yardstick to just tuck under that left edge and lift my clamp about a ½ inch. That allows my the arm of my quilting machine to slide freely back and forth. I'll prevent any funny square corners in my topographical map. And there we are, the end of our pass. So once again, I'll just leave Lucy's needle down and we'll go ahead and do the advance while she is still attached. I'm curious, anybody remember what my side measurements are? All right. So I'm following my same kind of little extra bits. I'm tugging on the batting a little bit underneath to make sure that it is snug down smoothly. I'm checking out my measurements left and right. All looks good. Of course, on this particular quilt, I don't really have a straight line on this front bar, you know, to use as a guideline for making sure that it's advancing straight. But what you guys can't see, and I'm able to, is the front fall that's hanging down in front of me. So I'm really keeping a weather eye on that to make sure it's not pulling in one direction or another, or getting the frowny shape or the smiley shape. So I always keep a weather eye on that as I'm quilting. So on the right hand side of my quilt, it's going pretty smoothly, so I don't even think I need to pin that one this time. But the left, once again, has quite a bit of this excess, so we'll just take a moment, use our pins, get it all in place. What was that old saying? A stitch in time saves 9. It takes way less time to pin it and do it slowly and carefully than it does to get it in place, run your basting stitch and find you've got a great big ripple at the bottom of your basting stitch, or worse yet, you do that a time or two and get to the bottom of your quilt and find that one side is far longer than the other. If I was not, you know, sort of paying attention to this and I just let this left side baste wherever it kind of fell naturally, certainly I would find when I got to the bottom of the quilt that the left side of my quilt is far longer. So a little bit of preventive work will keep that from happening. Okay, is there a question we should answer before I go on? And I'll get me a wee sip of coffee. Now, do I need to move Lucy? Are we okay? All right. I'll get a wee sip in while Dave loads it. So Dave, I'm seeing other things on my monitor entirely. There we go. Okay, Kathy. Hi, Susan. I saw an earlier episode you used a wavy basting stitch to take up fullness at the edge. Would that have worked with this quilt? Absolutely it would, Kathy. And I think I have talked about that before. When you've got a ton of excess that you've got to take up, winding your basting stitch off and on will help. In this particular quilt, it's a trade-off between, do I want my channel lock and my straight line on, or do I want the wavy basting stitch? 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. If I'm pretty sure that the line of my quilt is now pinned in place straight, I certainly could use that wavy basting line, and maybe I will, just to demonstrate it. Because yes, it is a tool in your arsenal of tricks. I have found a dull pin that won't go in. We will get rid of that one. Okay, and there's another question. I'll put a couple more pins in while that comes up. Lynn, as a new quilter, any suggestions for practice batting to use? I mean, you certainly could use, for example, an old flannel sheet if you've got one, or sometimes fleece can be super inexpensive at a big box craft store. Hobbs batting is not terribly expensive, and that's what I'm using right now is Hobbs 80/20, especially if you find it on sale too. So those are ideas. I mean, you kind of want a little bit of batting to get the feel of it, especially if you're messing with the tension of your machine. Quilting on a flannel quilt will not give you the same results of top and bottom tension as actually using a batting. So think about that in the process too. So this is what I mean by a wavy basting stitch, literally going on and off the fabric. That takes up the most possible excess. And I've got a doozy right here at this seam. I'm going to put yet another pin in there. My pins are literally less than ½ an inch apart. And I'm just waving on and off, on and off. It doesn't necessarily look pretty, but there are no pleats, and the fabric is evenly dispersed so that when I go to lay down my quilting design, it's going to look even. There's an almost pleat. I'm doing all these things, and boy, it's a little like patting your head and rubbing your stomach. You know, you're pulling on the seam that's already been stitched. You're trying not to hit your pins. You're stuffing fabric under the needle. All the things. Just take it slow. I will post pictures of this quilt when it's finished, and I'll try to get some just for you guys. I don't usually include the basted edge, but just for you guys, I'll try and get some that include like the whole quilt and or the edge so that you can see how much flatness we achieved when it's all said and done. And I will post them probably tomorrow. I usually try and take pictures in the morning is when I have best light in my studio. So within the next day or two, I will try and get those posted so you can come back and have a look and see what we managed to achieve. That pin can stay in. Okay, is there another question we want to do before I go to the other side? Susan Clark, what is the name of the quilting design that's on the quilt in the back? Oh, Susan, that is Crazy Eights, which you've seen me quilt before. We just happen to have the quilt sideways, so it maybe looks a little different because the quilt is, the one hanging behind me is longer this way, so we got more wall coverage, if that makes sense. So it's basically just hanging sideways. But it is Crazy Eights, which if you're new to Live and Unscripted, there have been 1 or 2 episodes on which I've done that design, and it is in fact freehand. It's one of my personal favorites. So I'm going to tuck in a little free tip for you that has nothing to do with long arm quilting, but might have to be helpful for you as you're piecing quilts if you send them off to a long armor. I'm just crossing the seam here that's in the backing fabric. It's running from side to side across this quilt. And most people, when they do backing seams, to reduce bulkiness, will press them open, which is a great idea. I love an open pressed seam. But many of the quilts that come to me from clients, they then fold in half right at that seam, folding it back shut. So my tip for you is fold that backing anywhere but right on that seam allowance. So even an inch to one side or the other will keep that nice open press open. Another question from Jody. Jody, my machine has 2 clamps on the side. What are your side clamps and do you get better tension? So my machine came with 2 clamps as well. I think I can hold the one up. That's the original strap that came with my machine. The disadvantage of that, Jody, is that it tends to put tension just on that inch wide area, right? And pull on it. Sometimes for various reasons on various quilts and even on these live and unscripted shows, you'll see me using them because my long ones won't be working in that situation for some reason. But ideally, the beauty of the long ones is they put even tension along the whole thing. And that is a good thing. They are made by Red Snapper, the ones that I use, but just look for ones that have, you know, a long space, basically as long as the throat of your machine will allow, as long as you can fit in there to use. And when you have to use the 2 clamps, it's not the end of the world. Just don't put a ton of tension on them. You don't want your quilt, you know, pulling into a scallop where those clamps are. Just enough tension to hold it snug. And, you know, my kind of rule of thumb is I can put my fingers up from underneath and I can grab them. So this is not a drum. I can't beat a drum message on the top of the quilt. It's just taut enough to be smooth. Okay, guys, which side did I finish on? The right. So we've got to start quilting on the right because we're alternating directions on our passes. And I'm not sure if this shows, but there is a fair bit of excess fabric in here that I'm going to be, again, manipulating with my left hand as I quilt to try and keep that all feeding evenly under the needle. There's not so much that I'm worried about getting a pleat, but it's critical that I get it evenly feeding under the needle. If I let it all accumulate and push to one area, that's when I'll get a pleat. And I'm working really close to my clamp. In an ideal world, I'd have a little more clearance there. So that's why I'm using my, can you see it? You can't. I'll show you. I'll try to show you. There we go. I've just got a yardstick that I'm just running under the clamp to lift it. Just a little. Dave's gonna change cameras so you guys can see. It's still hard to see. Basically, it's just resting on my rails and anything will work. A curtain rod, a dowel, in my case a yardstick, that just lifts my clamp a little, which lifts my side clamp a little so that my long arm can slide freely under there without, you know, meeting resistance. All that said, let's get quilting. So I talked earlier about a couple different ways to be manipulating this fabric. One is quilt with your right hand as I'm doing and use your left hand as kind of a counterweight to manipulate the fabric. Another is to use canned goods. So cans of veggies, cans of beans, anything that's a small weight that you can rest on both sides of your long arm. And if you align them front to back, they'll roll out of the way as you're quilting. But you will have to keep shifting them, you know, as you move areas. What was the third way I offered? Currently, I can't think and quilt. Oh yes, I know what it was. You can smooth out the fabric with your hands before you start stitching and put a few pins in here and there. And those act as like a checkpoint. You can make sure that you're getting in all the fabric before you get to the pin. It can't get away from you. So all of those are ways that you can deal with this excess fabric here. This is a pretty forgiving design to learn how to quilt one-handed on because the wobbles just don't matter. They're part of it. And as I said earlier too, the curvy quality of this design really helps because you can actually allow some of the excess to go between lines of stitching, if that makes sense, and the next curve just pulls it up, and that will look completely intended when the quilt is finished. A pleat will never look like it was done on purpose, but having just a little bit of excess bulge in there will totally look natural. When you wash the quilt, it's all good. And you see how I'm traveling way across to get back to my left-hand side? That will not be visible at all when it's all said and done because I've just spaced it like the pattern. And there, can you see I was stitching down seams, bulky seams that were there? Again, one of the great beauties of stitching freehand is that you have 100% control over where your stitching falls. And I know there's some of you out there laughing saying, well, I might have 75% control of where my stitches land. But 100% control is the goal. The point is you get to choose. You get to fudge it. If you'd like to see some better examples where you can see a little better this design quilted out, I recently posted some pins on my Pinterest account. So it is called Stitched by Susan. And I think if you look on my tutorials board, you'll see a couple examples of pins where I used this design. It was on a panel quilt. It just happens to be in much lighter colors, and you'll be able to get some better visuals of what this looks like quilted out. If you want to, you can use your tape measure as a secondary tool here for knowing where the barrier is for how far you can quilt before you bump into the front rail of your machine. So you can actually fudge the placement of your tape so that it marks the front of your quilting area. Dual purpose tool right there. Once again, I used the technique of just echoing along my lines at a similar spacing to move to an area I thought, oh, I can get a whole nother set of meanders in there before I advance my quilt. So I just echoed along them till I got back to where I wanted to fill in some more. And we've just run out of bobbin thread. So those of you who watch regularly know that I don't use a counter on my bobbin to tell me when I'm running low on thread. I just go till it runs out and then I change it. Perhaps not the most scientific method, but the one I choose. And basically why I'm undoing a few stitches is because I have let it run out. That means that the last 2 inches or so did not have proper tension on them. They weren't in the tension disc of the bobbin. And so I undo that little bit before I splice my new thread in. And of course it's really tricky to undo on this woolen fabric. Woolen? Cotton? That's what it feels actually most like, is wool. I don't think it is a wool blend, but it has that kind of feel, that kind of thick, the threads sink into it feel. So what I'm going to do is just trim my threads right close to the quilt, and when I start my new ones, I'll overlap a bit. And I'm dropping my seam ripper right there so I can find it when I come back, because it's not very visible. Save myself just a little bit of headache. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm using the same bobbin thread, bottom and top, or same thread, sorry, in the bobbin and the top. So I just had a bobbin winding on my freestanding winder. And I'm pretty sure that one more bobbin will do it. If I thought I needed yet more, I would just pop another one on the winder while I'm over there. It takes about 3 seconds to do it. And that enables me to wind my own bobbins, which is economical and allows me to match my threads. So I'm overlapping about 1/4 inch what was already stitched. I'm going to do a few lock stitches to hold it in place and then begin stitching, and I'm going to leave my tails there. If I trimmed my tails right away, it would just, the stitches would pull right out because they're so short. But if I leave them in place, go ahead and do a little more stitching and then pause for a second and trim the tails right close to the fabric. No one will be any the wiser. Again, I'm just traveling till I get to the area that I want to be stitching next. Just echoing what's been stitched before, so it looks like it was meant to be. Some threads there. And parking Lucy in the basting stitches. So we're coming along. I would say we have 2 more passes for those of you who are wondering how long we shall be here today. So you'll get a couple more looks at that process of pinning and basting the edges. If there are any questions, now's a great time to be popping them in the comments. Once again, if you're enjoying and finding these videos helpful, I would be so appreciative if you would like and subscribe to the channel, and if you would share with your quilter friends who you think might benefit too by my style of quilting / teaching / doing oopses live on camera. Because that has happened a few times. It's looking pretty good. I'm seeing the nice front edge. It's looking pretty good. This time I would say the right side is what needs a little boosting, a little pulling up. And the left side is fairly snug, so that's fine. I will pay attention to the right side with my pins this time around. I'm just distributing all that fullness as evenly as I can, so it's not all appearing in one place. Pleats are the enemy. Let's see if we need any pins on the left. Looks pretty good, actually. Make sure that batting is flat. Looking good. Again, I certainly could be using the wavy basting stitch. I could be pulling from behind. I'm kind of choosing to push from in front this time because I've got these several black seams that are angled up, and I've just got to shove them basically under the hopper foot. Otherwise the hopper foot just wants to push them way out in front, and I don't want that. So once the right is basted, we're going to break thread and go do the left. I'll just pop on my stretcher gripper before I leave this side. This one is a little tricky because I do have that backing seam allowance now that I'm dealing with, so it's just taking me a moment to tuck that in. Got it. Maybe I'd be wise to pin here too. Can you see there's just a fair bit of, well, you can't really see. There's a fair bit of ruffling going on in front of the needle. So I will just take a moment to pin it. My mom was a great one for sayings, you know, stitch in time saves 9. Ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Yeah, all of those. And it's really true. Takes far less time to do it, take a little preventive step or two than it does to have to go back and undo or redo or be unhappy with the result. And as I've said several times throughout this process, don't let the challenges that this fabric brings stop you from using it. Just be aware and have ways to cope. But don't let it bypass you just because you think, oh gosh, that looks hard. It kind of is, but it's very doable. Come on now. Yep, that bulky seam does not want to go into my gripper. It really doesn't. I may not be able to get it in. It's pretty thick. I'm persevering because I have such a slim edge here that I feel like if I just put the 2 clamps on it, they're really going to get in the way of my quilting. So bear with me while I take the time to try and get this into the snapper. It's really not wanting to go. For every area that I get in, 2 more pop out. Feels like. I got it. I got it. There we go. Okay, and we shall start stitching on the right because that is where we left off. Oh, I need to put my clamps on one more time. And here we go. So for those of you who are watching this in early October, we're switching live broadcast days, as I mentioned, to Fridays. So the 15th of October is the third Friday of the month, but October happens to have 5 Fridays. So I'm open to doing another episode on the 5th Friday, which would be the 29th of October. And I thought it might be fun to do something, a different topic, not necessarily quilting a project, but talking about something else, like maybe tension adjustments, like what are the various tweaks for tension, or thread choices, or what's the process for basting an entire quilt if you're working on a custom one, and you need to baste the whole thing in place. So all of that to say, if there's a topic that you're interested in, and it does not have to be at the long arm, it's something I could do on a whiteboard or talk about. If there's a topic you're interested in hearing about, by all means let me know. So you can just email me, info@stitchedbysusan.com, and I would love to have your vote on what you'd like to hear about on that Friday. Every so often I just about lose track of where I am. It's so tricky to see on this fabric. That's why you hear hesitation sometimes in my quilting. I'm like, where am I again? Get my bearings and go on. Before I get to the end of this pass, I'm going to drop out a couple teasers to you guys. A few of you here are students of mine in my Freehand Quilting Masterclass, and I am in a few weeks' time going to be launching another session of that class. So the teaser is, be on the alert for some fun free sessions and a mini course that's going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks. So best way to know infallibly about that is to sign up for my newsletter, but watch me on social media too and you'll see those things up and coming. So as you can see, the freehand and the edge to edge are the type of quilting that I love to do. So of course, spoiler alert, the things that I'm offering will have to do with that type of quilting. But if that interests you, keep your eye out. There's some fun stuff on the horizon. I'm going to echo my way back and put a few more in here. These seams just laid down so beautifully nice and flat when I just quilt right over them. Perfect. So this is going to be the last advance. So be gathering up your final questions if you have them. While I forward this, we'll do one last baste across the bottom, so that's going to take a couple of minutes because it's going to need some pinning. I know it is. So this is going to be the last advance. So gathering up your final questions if you have them. We're just doing a mic check. Poor Mr. Producer was having a heart attack over here. He thought he'd lost me on the mic, but it sounds like we're all good. Okay, you guys, we're going to talk the hard decisions here for a minute. I think, Dave, if we could we have the big camera that has the overview? So I'm going to show you guys. This is the one from my right, please. Yeah. There we go. It doesn't show up super duper clearly in the camera, but I'm going to tell you. You can probably tell by my tape measure. As we've been quilting, I've been pulling the left up to keep my width of my quilt even, and the quilt wanted to bear off to the right, which I didn't really talk about as we were quilting, but I kept nudging it toward the left. So what I'm left with now is my right hand corner is about 1 inch longer than my left hand side. So basically I'm faced with a decision here. I have to go one way or the other. Can we see my face in any way? If I get close enough there? It's awkward to have me talking with my head cut off. Or we can go to the other camera now. Sorry, you guys. Thanks for bearing with us. It's always a bit of a juggle. But I'm faced with 2 choices now. One is to leave my quilt less than square and use all the piecing that Bev has provided for me, all the fabric. And option number 2 would be to square up my basting edge, which is going to lose some of the quilt on that right hand corner. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And I guess there's a third choice, which is kind of steer down the middle. And that's actually what I'm going to choose. And I'll tell you why I'm not just going to follow the edge of the quilt, which I could do. And that is because the backing is plaid. So it is going to show on the backing if I have a wildly slanting line, right? So Bev, you can tell me afterwards if I made the right decision for you. But this happens sometimes when you're quilting. You've got to make a choice about the quilt top with the factors that you're dealing with. You've got to make a choice. So the choice I make is I'm going to stay fairly square with my quilt. I'm going to angle about 1/2 inch off to save as much of the quilt as I can, and Bev's probably going to lose about 1/2 inch of quilt. So that, that's just the decision I'm faced with. And once again, I'm going to stop and put a few pins in here. Be wise, Susan, be wise. And while I'm pinning, if you guys are quilting today and need something to listen to, remember that I do have a little podcast, and it's about quilters and a few other crafters and their stories. So it's called Measure Twice, Cut Once. And the thumbnail is my coral color, so it's easy to find on all the podcast platforms, but you can always go to podcast.stitchedbysusan.com to find it. And I will, just because I'm so stoked about it, mention that I actually hit a milestone last week, 10,000 downloads, which to me was absolutely astonishing. My husband kind of talked me into starting the podcast on a bit of a whim, and it is finding people that love it, which I'm so thrilled about. Okay, taking a few minutes to pin the front of the quilt. You're not going to see my head, but you'll see my hands. The goal being, again, to just distribute that fullness evenly and then to keep it where I want it to be. It's not actually too roughly. It's not bad, but I don't want it to be able to shift out in front of me. So those pins are going to give me checkpoints. I'm going to take my machine and go off to the right hand side, and instead of basting across the bottom and then up the right, which I probably would typically do, I'm actually going to baste down this right hand side, pulling up all the excess that I can, and that's just going to give me another an idea of how much of this corner I can sort of pull in and salvage, if that makes sense. So let's get our pins in place and let's see how much of this we can ease up in there. I'm going to let just a little of it fall off to the right. Yeah, you can see my hands on camera. If you're trying to ease fabric this way and ease fabric this way, you're kind of doubling your problem. So if I let a little bit of it veer off on the right hand side, that will give me that much more room that I can pull fabric up here and get that excess in. And I just know that from doing it a bajillion times and working with fabric. So now you know it too. So I'm going to lose probably 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch on this side of the corner. Which honestly, some people who send me their quilts square up the tops before they send them, and I think they lose more than that sometimes. So I don't think it's an awful thing. I have found another dull pin. I can't stand dull pins. Got to get rid of that one. And the way I know that is just when it's resisting when I'm trying to push it through the fabric. Pins don't last forever, right? They're a bit like knives. They do go dull. That actually worked pretty darn well, pulling up some of that excess. We're not going to lose very much except just right in the very corner. So it's all good. I'm basting down that right-hand side, just coaxing my fabric under the needle. Of course, the upside of this fabric being very stretchy is it's also, you can manipulate it in too. Like you can actually push fullness in there and it will take up a lot of that and just absorb it into the weave. So it works for you before and against. So use the properties of it. Here we've got a lot of extra, and you can see I'm literally just pushing that extra under the needle. There's no pleats, and we'll be able to take that up and camouflage it in the quilting. I've got to advance the quilt just a hair. I'm right against my front rail. And I'm just going to baste right off the edge and leave that right-hand side for the moment. And then I'll start again on the shorter side of the quilt and baste my way across the bottom edge. So you're getting to see all kinds of things today. And I'm always open to suggestions too. If some of you have found better ways of dealing with this, or a reason to make a choice one way rather than the other way, I'm all ears. So by all means, chime into the comments. I have not done everything. This is just the best I know how at this point in my quilting journey. So now I've got it all pinned, and I'm just having a look at that. It is not too bad. So I've lost about almost 3/8 of an inch on the right-hand corner, and I'm going to lose about the same, maybe a little bit more on this bottom of the right-hand side. And because of the way the piecing is arranged, I don't think anyone will ever know except us, and we're not telling. So I'm going to start basting right down close to the edge. I do not have my channel lock on. I am going to do this freehand. That is up to you. Another option would be, if you have channel lock, would be to put it on and adjust it a couple times if you need to make it lower by a stitch or two here and there. Maybe I'll do that just so you can see it. So I'll put the channel lock on right now. So now I'm stitching a perfectly horizontal line. When I find that my basting seam is getting quite wide, as it is there, I'll take the channel lock off, pull my machine down just a stitch width, and continue going. And I'll probably do that half a dozen times across the quilt. And you can see why it would be easier to just not have it on and freehand that, but that is an option. And I did turn it off because I want to get to the other side. So now I'm going to start angling and taking a bit more off the quilt. So that was my kind of middle road. My seam angled a little bit, making my bottom not perfectly straight. And now I'm letting a bit of the excess quilt fall off, making it not perfectly square. And I feel like that's a pretty good balance between the two decisions that I had. Whoops. I veered quite a bit there. Let's go a little straighter. And that will all fall into the binding seam allowance. So yeah, I've lost 5/8 of an inch, I would say there. So Bev, you can let me know in the comments, are you going to be okay with that? Oops. Oh my scissors seems to be getting dull. Okay, you guys, it's all basted. We are ready to quilt. Well, almost. We've got to put our clamps on the side yet. I was mentioning earlier that I'm thinking about doing a third live and unscripted episode in October, and I was asking you to email in your suggestions. You're certainly welcome to type them in now, but for reasons I don't fully understand, the live chat, when we're chatting, when we're live, is hidden after the YouTube video gets posted, so I can't come back and see them easily afterwards. So that's why I'd really prefer if you email them to me. Now, Dave, can we see because of the roll on the quilt, or do I need to forward it a bit? We're just checking a little bit at visibility here. Yeah. So what I'm going to do, you can see that when I get too close to that roll, it really interferes with the camera because it's so low. I'm just going to back up the quilt a little bit. And where did we finish? On the left or on the right, folks? I think it was on the left. Truthfully, with this pattern, it does not matter vastly. So what that adjusting of my quilt meant is I'm not going to be able to finish it quite at the front rail. So I'm just going to make a kind of skinny pass across and then forward it just a couple inches and then finish. So here we go. Pretty music, please, Mr. Producer. Oh, and he's telling me it's been on the whole time. I'm just out of the loop. This funky fabric, far from discouraging me, has made me want to make a quilt out of this. It feels so beautiful. It's just got this lovely suede-y texture. Can you see how I'm using my left hand as a weight to literally put tension on the fabric? That's what enables me to keep the pleats from forming. In the same way that I've paid extra attention on the left as we've been quilting, now I'm going to pay extra attention on the right here because there's a fair bit that needs to be smoothed in. Just kind of stretching that fabric a little bit over the nose of Lucy underneath just enables it to feed that fullness in evenly. Can you see here? There's this little buildup back here, which if I were to just let go would make a pleat up there. But I'm not gonna just let go. I'm gonna hang on to it. Slow down. Stretch it over Lucy's little front end there. And there we go. It's in. I don't think I can overstate how valuable it is to master that knack of knowing how much you can kind of get out of your fabric. It's just a thing I see so commonly is quilts that have pleats and tucks in them. And the quilter will say, well, I just couldn't help it. And you know, I'm not going to be critical. There probably are some times when you just can't help it. But as you can see, I'm managing to get quite a bit of it taken up in there. I'm going to grab my yardstick for this end for a moment. And we're going to advance just that 2 inches or so. And now this will be our final time across. And while I'm walking back and forth, I'll pull the tape measure off because we don't need it anymore. And this, by the way, I'll just show you. This is the little clip that I use. That's all how simple of a tool I have to hold my tape measure in place at each end. Just a little office pincher. And here we're down at this corner. Again, we've got a little bit of fullness here. I'm just going to take some time. Putting tension on the fabric here and there just so it's evened out. Take my time, stitch it down. There we go. And now when this comes off the rails, and especially when it gets washed the first time, that will just absolutely disappear and just appear to be texture and fullness because of the design we're quilting. Perfect. Seriously, I want a quilt just like this one. It's absolutely gorgeous. There are not all that many quilts that are unreservedly masculine, but this is one of them. And I just quilted myself into a corner. Okay, hang on. I gotta find my way out of here, people. Got it. I think that's the first time that has ever happened to me, that I lost my bearings in the forest and couldn't find my way out of my meander.